Hello, fellow Rebel Capitals. Hope you're well. Got a lot to talk about. Usually, well, as of the last few months, there's been a lot of economic data that's been softening. So that's kind of what we're focusing on because you get so much of the buy in the mainstream media. So I want to give you something to offset that so you guys can come to a conclusion or incorporate all the data, a complete picture into your analysis to figure out what the probabilities are of a recession or a no landing or a soft landing, inflation, disinflation, deflation, higher interest rates, lower interest rates, market going up, market going down, gold going up, gold going down. You get it. So you can figure that out as far as the probabilities for 2025. So today I want to go over why the recession could have just been canceled. The recession that we have been talking about on this channel, it may have just been canceled due to this. Check it out. First and foremost, we're going to look at this Zero Hedge article, which, truth be told, gave me the idea for this video. Recession canceled. U.S. industrial production jumps to record high. Look at this. So, I mean, we've been talking about the reinversion of the curve. We've been talking about the GDP now indicator from the Atlanta Fed going down to negative 2.8. Now it's, I think, right around negative 2.1. We're talking about all of the consumer sentiment surveys that are just completely tanking. I think yesterday we talked about the New York Fed, the manufacturing survey coming out and going down to a negative 20. A negative 20 when the expectations were for like negative 1.5. So a lot of the data we have been seeing, in addition to, I think, the anecdotal evidence that you guys are seeing in the real economy, would point to an economic slowdown. But that's not all the data. We've got this. So what we have to do is look at a complete picture, obviously, and then we have to take the good with the bad and everything in between and kind of do this weighing mechanism. If you want to give you a visual there, you know, you got the good stuff, the bad stuff, and which outweighs which, and which direction is the trend going. I think that's what's important here. So when you look at this data point and exclude everything else, this looks pretty good. And right here by Zero Hedge, with a recession narrative crushing gain of 0.7 month over month, better than the 0.2 month over month expected. And I wish they had a chart. Well, look at this. Yeah. So in U.S. industrial production rose to an all-time record high in February. Look at this. And this chart goes all the way back to early 2000s, prior to the GFC. And you can see that we really fall off a cliff there. Now, we did have a slowdown in mid 2010s that didn't result in a recession, but it looks like, or you would assume, every time we do get a recession, you do see a huge decline. Look what happened in the cerveza sickness. No surprise there. And then we've kind of been flatlining at this higher level, and then we see this big bump up. Now, I'm a little skeptical here because this bump looks like it coincides with Trump's inauguration, or at least Trump getting elected. Tariffs. We're going to be talking about that here in just a moment. So, and when you look at why this went up, it was because of auto parts and things that go into the production of autos. When you guys know from watching my videos, especially recently, auto sales have been plummeting in the United States, plummeting. So, and that's one of the reasons why we had the retail sales that disappointed to the downside, was because of auto sales being so weak. So auto sales are doing a Wile E. Coyote, yet the things that go into the production of autos, those are ramping up. That is causing this increase in industrial production in the United States. I don't know. A little suspicious there. Something tells me this could, and I don't know if this is just my hypothesis, my guess, this could have something to do with tariffs and all these manufacturers freaking out that their input costs are going to go up, the inputs that go into whatever's being produced here. And so they're trying to input everything, produce as much as possible before, something breaks, let's say. And that's maybe what we're seeing. Maybe it's not. Maybe the economy is absolutely booming, or at least this portion of the economy, but it just really wouldn't add up when auto sales are tanking. But let's keep going here. Manufacturing output rose 0.9%, boosted by a jump of 8.5% in the index for motor vehicles and parts. Yeah. The output of manufacturing, excluding more motor vehicles, increased 0.4. So that's good news, because once you strip out autos, which is, I'm a little suspicious, we are still at a positive number. So durable manufacturing increased 1.6%. Okay, nothing that really stands out there on the chart. Mining output grew 2.8% in February after falling 3.2% in January. Yeah, that would definitely coincide with the economy slowing down. Yeah, see, you get this bump, and again, it is, I don't know. That's right at the election. But look at the trend. The trend is just straight down, which, you see during recessions, with the exception of the mid 2010s. But even at that time, it's not like the economy was just going gangbusters here in 2015. That's for sure. And then zero hedge always has to take it back to the dollar crashing and interest rates going to 400,000% because of hyperinflation. That's just, you always have to include that in zero hedge. So they say this won't help the doves, or Besant and Trump, who want long-term yields lower. There's no way long-term yields are going higher. We're going to get hyperinflation. Yields are going to, straight to 10% at the long end of the curve, and the dollar is going to crash, and blah, 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 blah. That's how they always have to spin it. But obviously, the data that they're providing in this article is fantastic. And it does beg the question, does this mean that the recession has been canceled? Now, this isn't all the data that would lead us to a conclusion, or that could lead us to a conclusion that the economy might not be doing great, but it's not contracting yet. Let's look at construction jobs. And this is something I never knew about. I got in a debate with a guy that, that's neither here nor there, but he pointed this out. It's very good observation. And I've heard, there's another guy that's fantastic from, is it something 42? What is his? Warren Pies, I believe it's his name. And he points this out all the time. And they've got a great point. Look, when we have a recession in the United States, you almost always see manufacturing jobs tank. Or excuse me, not manufacturing, construction jobs tank. And look at what we're seeing. Now, just for the sake of the video, and just for the sake of being impartial, I do want to pull up the industrial, I can't talk today, the transportation jobs. Because with the transportation jobs, you see the exact same thing as far as recessions. But let's see, truck transportation. Let's do all transportation. I think that's the one we're looking for. No, this is not the chart we're looking for. Anyway, it's one of the transportation charts. Maybe it's truck transportation. And yeah, this is, well, if this isn't the chart I'm looking for, it doesn't really matter, because you see the same thing. When we get a recession, this drops, and we've had this big drop, which would imply that, things aren't going well. And when you look at truck transportation, that makes a lot of sense, because that's just moving goods back and forth. So if the economy is slowing down, you would expect this to decrease as well. There's been a lot of bankruptcies in the trucking kind of sector over the last few years. But just keeping it the focus here on the construction jobs and the part that's, I'm getting ahead of myself here. The good news is this is going up. And we see it kind of flatlining, but it definitely hasn't rolled over yet. So this would be kind of on the side of, well, maybe, we're not headed for a recession yet. Or you'd have to put this in that bucket for sure. Now, the next one, and this was an indicator that I was really concerned about, but we're starting to see that roll back down to where it's getting better. So we see the credit card delinquencies just skyrocket here. Now, it is true that they went straight up, but we were still at an extremely low level historically. Even in the mid 90s, we were above where we were when we saw this big spike. And it got up to 3.24%, and then we see it starting to come back down. So that's a good sign. And here's another one that I always look at, because this gives me an idea of how many loans are being created in the real economy. And now, maybe not so much in the real economy, but how many loans are being created in general, therefore how much risk taking is being done by the banking system, the domestic banking system. And to me, that would be a proxy for how well the economy is doing, because if I own a bank and I'm only going to lend to people that I think can pay me back, and assuming that they're going to pay me back with wages, income, revenue, something like that, then I've got to be confident in their revenue or in their income stream. And that would be, in my view, a reflection of the underlying fundamentals of the economy. And so we see that going up. Now, of course, this can be skewed, like right here. Why did it go up during the survey sickness? Because the government came in and backstopped everything. And so this is PPP, most likely. All of these PPP loans that are being created, or these people just drawing down their lines of credit that, you could say implicitly were being backstopped by the government. And therefore, you actually see it go up, when usually in a normal recession, without the government, you would expect this to decline, or at the very least flatline, which is what we've seen in the past. So now it is true that although we're not down, it isn't great, because it's way below trend. And I mean, look at the trend prior to the GFC. And look at where we were here in the 2010s, which again was not a booming economy by any stretch of the imagination. And then you look at where we are now, where it is growing. But again, that line is not like this. It's more like this. So, but if I had to put this in, I guess on this hand, we're looking at good news or bad news, let's say. This hand, we're looking at good news. And in the middle, we're looking at, it's not good. It's not great. And that would lead you to the conclusion that maybe we're not headed toward a recession, or at least we might not be on the brink of it. And this would be a chart, a data point that I would throw into that middle bucket. Here's another one that most people never talk about. And although we talk about it on this channel quite a bit. Look at what the dollar has done. Maybe not the last 6 months, but probably the last 3 months here. So we have gone from, call it almost 110, straight down to 103.2. This is great news. This is great news for the global economy, because this takes a lot of pressure off those entities that have dollar-denominated debt. And then you say, oh, George, who cares? We only care about MAGA in the United States. We don't care about what's happening to Japanese banks or Japanese exporters or whatever. Well, you should, because at the end of the day, if you want America to be great, you're going to need the help of other economies. And the better they're doing, most likely, the better the United States will do. We have a globally connected economy. No matter how much manufacturing Trump brings back to the United States, we are still going to be loosely connected to the global economy. And the lower Well, look, if the dollar just plummets, we get the zero hedge hyperinflation and the dollar goes to 50 overnight, well, no, that's not good for the global economy. But if the dollar goes from 110 down to 103 down to maybe 95, that's best case scenario. Best case scenario for the global economy in terms of alleviating a lot of that pressure from the dollar being extremely high and making those dollar denominated debts and those dollar based inputs, the commodities that go into making that widget, to make that it doesn't alleviate all the pressure, but it reduces it substantially. So they can take a deep breath. They've got some wiggle room now, and then they can go ahead and focus on producing, making more stuff, hiring more workers, as opposed to, holy cow, where on earth am I going to get the dollars to pay down effectively my monthly mortgage payment? So I would like to see this, although it's not my base case, I would like to see this go even lower. I mean, if we can get, and I think that's probably why it could be why Scott Bessent is always pounding the table about lower and lower interest rates, and Trump wants lower and lower interest rates. It could be for the United States. I mean, I get that argument, but it also could be just a bailout for the global economy, which inevitably would impact the United States, either negatively if they crash, or positively if they're doing well enough to get out of the shadow of this mountain of dollar denominated debt that they have. And I want to be clear, it's not just the debt, it's the input cost being denominated in dollars. Therefore, if your revenues are yen, let's say your inputs are dollars, even if those commodity prices aren't going up in dollar terms, in yen terms, they're still going up. And that means lower profit margins. That means you producing less stuff. That means you hiring fewer workers. And that means you are a bigger risk. And if that dollar loan, your liability, is an asset of a bank, that means they have higher risk and they are going to be providing a lot less dollar liquidity to the rest of the, let's say, monetary system. And that, of course, that increase of risk, that lower dollar liquidity, is going to impact the United States. It doesn't necessarily mean that it takes you into a recession, but it's definitely a headwind. So this I would put in the category of maybe not just good news. I'd put this in the category of great news, especially if the dollar continues to decline. Now let's go over to an argument that I hear all the time, so I'll go over it. Quite frankly, I'm all about the arguments that I made earlier in this video, and I think they're completely valid. This, not so much. Not so much. But let's just go over it, because I know it is a very popular argument with a lot of people in the MAGA camp here. So how tariffs will lower the cost of living. I would start off by saying they will probably lower the cost of living, but that's not the lowering of the cost of living you want. Meaning lowering the cost of living you want is through the production of more goods and services, not due to an economy going into recession, because that will lower the cost of living as well. But we don't want those lower prices. or we don't want lower prices due to deflation, or we don't want lower price, not due to deflation, but we don't want deflation due to an economic slowdown. We want deflation due to more goods and services, which is where you have to start, right? That's always your North Star in determining whether it's tariffs or any other economic policy is going to be a benefit on net balance. But getting to this here, let's go over these arguments. Maybe they're valid. Okay, contrary to popular belief, tariffs did not raise the cost of goods during the Trump presidency. Okay, so, but then of course they fail to tell you why. Number one, what were the tariffs? Like 2-3%, 5%, something like that. And they're just on very select goods. And then at the same time, the dollar was going up. So if the dollar is going up, then that basically offsets, or can offset, the tariff itself, and the Chinese government was coming in and subsidizing the manufacturers that were importing, or some of them that were importing to the United States, so it didn't affect their margins. So they could lower their dollar cost, and it really wouldn't impact their bottom line in terms of yuan, right? And at the end of the day, that's what their input cost, or a lot of their input costs are, unless they were huge widget makers that needed a lot of those commodity inputs that we were talking about earlier that are denominated in dollars. You see, this gets very complex, and a lot of it depends on what type of widget you're making and the overall business model. But that would be 3 reasons as to why you didn't see a big price increase. But I mean, we didn't see a price increase, but did we see less stuff, or did we see, an economic slowdown? Would the economy have been better? Who knows? It's always the counterfactual, right? But we can't just what I'm getting at here, the main takeaway is you can't sit there and say, well, we didn't have price increases in 2018, therefore we will not have price increases moving forward if we do tariffs. I mean, that's nonsense, right? It's like taking a bottle of Advil and saying, well, we didn't have any side effects if we took one last night and we didn't have any side effects. So if we just take 25 of them right now, then obviously we're not going to have any side effects. It doesn't really work that way. A lot of variables. But it is true that if he only does 5%, and if he continues to do this kind of carve out here and carve out there, and if the dollar were to go back up to maybe 110 or 115, although that would be bad for a lot of different entities, and in a way that would be bad in my view for the United States economy. But that would alleviate some of the price pressures from these manufacturers that are importing into the United States, because at the end of the day, and we'll get into this in a moment, their margins are very thin. It's not like they're running at a 25% margin. So if they're running at a 5% margin and you increase the tariff by 25%, it's not possible for them to absorb that cost. Okay. Next. Oh, he said, well, first, a tariff is a tax imposed on imports. Got it. For example, a 25% tariff on steel would increase the price of steel coming from Canada or South Korea. However, that same tariff would not apply to steel that was made in America. In this way, tariffs are a completely avoidable tax. Come on, buddy. Come on. Even if you favor tariffs, which is fine, which is totally fine, but from an economic standpoint, because from a negotiating standpoint, I think that's a completely different conversation. We're just talking about tariffs from the standpoint of an economic policy. You can't say that they're completely avoidable. I mean, this is nonsense. Everybody knows that. Sure, we produce a lot of stuff in the United States, but there's a lot of stuff that we don't produce. And by the way, if you can just choose to buy American, then why on earth are people buying from Canada and South Korea right now? Like, obviously, if they could produce the widget that they're producing at the same cost and as efficiently by buying from the United States, they'd probably do that. Like there's a reason they're buying from Canada or they're buying from South Korea. And keep in mind, there's already a tariff. It's called a transport cost. And this is something that nobody ever talks about, and I don't really know why. Because if you're having to import a good from South Korea, you have to pay something that you would not pay if that good was produced in the United States. And that's the cost of transportation to get it across this little body of water called the Pacific Ocean. That's not free. That is not free. So that in and of itself is increasing the cost above and beyond, all else being equal, above and beyond what you would pay if that good was produced in the United States. But yet these entities, the retailers, let's say in the United States, are still buying them, or the manufacturers using those as an input are still buying them from South Korea or Canada. So why? Right? There's a reason that they're doing this. And then you have the obvious that all things that are produced overseas are not produced in the United States. And you can't just flip on a light switch and say, "Oh, wow, this, this widget that has been the pharmaceutical. Now, can we produce that in the United States? Sure, we can go ahead and do that, but it doesn't happen overnight, and this could take potentially decades to set up these supply chains and to set up these manufacturing facilities, and also to get the human resources you need to develop these goods. It's not like you just wave a magic wand and it's like, boom, there's a factory that's cranking out something that we've never made in the United States before, that they only make in Taiwan, as an example. Maybe it's semiconductors. So this is really disingenuous. I mean, you can argue that tariffs are good on net, but you can't argue that they're just a completely avoidable tax. That's nonsense. Not only do tariffs create an incentive for consumers to buy American, but they also create an incentive for foreign producers to lower their costs. And here, this is another just really weak argument. If countries like China, Mexico want to access American market, which they certainly will, then they'll have to find a way to reduce their costs to balance out the tariff. Ultimately, lower production costs will benefit everyone. Okay, but again, this assumes they have 100% margin. So if Trump just increases or a 25% margin, they just reduce it. Now they got a 75% margin. Who cares? They just buy a few more or a few fewer Ferraris or whatever it is, right? That's not the way this works. These margins are razor thin. Now you can say, okay, well, they'll have to become even more competitive. All right, but if that's the case, then what you're saying is the United States manufacturing will just become less competitive, right? Because if what you're doing is making them be more competitive, more productive by creating this barrier for them, well, what you're doing, that barrier that you're creating for these companies is acting as a shield for these other companies. So if it makes these companies more productive, then by definition, it'll make these companies in the United States less productive. So I'm not saying that's what would happen or that's my base case, but I'm saying if you want to be intellectually honest about this conversation, or excuse me, about this argument, you would have to acknowledge the fact that if this is creating more productivity over here, it would create less productivity over here. To begin with, Americans' manufacturing industry is among the most productive in the world. Again, then why are we buying stuff from overseas? And they kind of, given the productivity is ultimate drives prices, American manufacturing goods should also be among the cheapest in the world. And so the reason they give, I think is right up here, is just because basically China is manipulating their currency. And this again is a pretty poor argument, because I could argue that China's currency is artificially high, not artificially low. And if all that was required to be a manufacturing powerhouse was just a cheap currency, then why don't we just, instead of all these tariffs, why don't we just lower the price of the dollar? Why don't we just artificially drop the price on the DXY using it as a proxy down to 50, 60, something like that. And all of a sudden we'd have this giant manufacturing renaissance. There's a lot more to it than that. So it's basically, the argument is we have all this manufacturing capacity here. It's just not being utilized because all of these other countries are cheating. And therefore, if we create the tariffs, then we're going to nullify the effect of them cheating, basically. And I find this argument very difficult to buy into, because them cheating is central planning. So what you're saying is their central planning has made them so much more efficient than the United States at producing cheaper goods. We just can't compete with that central planning. And therefore, to compete with their central planning, so we have a level playing field, we need to have more central planning ourselves. And if you just kind of think that through, it to me, that doesn't make any sense. If they want to put a tax on their citizens for XYZ, if they want to distort their economy through central planning, let them. That just impedes their progress long term, right? What we should do to compete with them is have more free market capitalism, take away the restrictions of the regulations, the bureaucracy, the red tape, etc. And then that gives us a competitive advantage regardless of what they're doing. Take the shackles off the private sector. And this is why I always say with these tariffs, I would much prefer, instead of to make their products a lot worse, or instead of to make them a lot worse, why don't we make us a lot better? Right? And you don't make us a lot better by just taking away all the competition, or you make us a lot better by taking away the things that made us slow and lethargic to begin with, which is the rules, the regulations, the bureaucracy. It wasn't just China devaluing their currency. That's not who we have to blame for there not being any manufacturing in the United States. Oh, here's where they talk about foreign currency manipulation and predatory trade practices. So we talked about that. That's basically central planning. So the argument here is that their central planners are really, really smart. And the way they did it gives them a huge competitive advantage that Americans just, there's no way that we can compete in that field because we just don't have the incredible, amazing central planning that they have. And therefore, to make everything level, we've got to have more socialism. We got to have more communism. We have to have more government involvement. We need more economic distortions. This doesn't make any sense to me. Further, tariffs will reshore American factories and thereby increase domestic output. Okay, fine. Let's just assume for a moment that it does increase domestic output. At the end of the day, how do you lower prices? How do you lower prices? You create more goods and services. Not just more goods and services in the United States, more goods and services, period. Right? So let's just say that we reduce 25% of, let's say we have a pie chart of all the goods and services in the United States, and we reduce that by 25% by putting up these tariffs. Okay, now we only have 75%. And you say, well, George, but we'll increase manufacturing in the United States. Great. So let's just say that takes us back up to 90, but we still have 10% fewer than we started with, right? But we have increased U.S. manufacturing. But even though we've done that, we're still poor. And sure, it might create jobs over here, but it increases prices over there. And if it were more efficient to do this, we'd already be doing it, right? If it made sense, the risk reward for capital to come into the United States to build these factories, they would already be doing it. So then the question becomes, well, why aren't they? Because there's no tariffs? No, no. Look, we got plenty of domestic consumption. The reason is because there's too many rules, regulations, and bureaucracy. Okay, domestic output, we got that. So here they go on to talk about, let's see, finally, the only way to decrease prices in the long run is to increase productivity. Well, I completely agree with that. I just don't know how tariffs increase productivity. I mean, look, if this was true, Argentina would be the most productive country on the planet Earth. If that's all it took, all we have to do is just, charge a 100% tax to our consumers on imported goods. What have we been waiting for? And I like this. They talk about how tariffs is the best way to invent and implement new technology. Come on. The best catalyst for this is higher input costs. So he's actually arguing that the best way to invent and implement new technology And to increase productivity is to just increase input costs, particularly the labor costs. Oh, wait a minute here. I thought that one of the reasons why China and other places manufacture more than we do and therefore are more productive is because they have cheap labor. Now all of a sudden you're telling me that all we have to do is have labor costs skyrocket and wow, the productivity will go through the roof. I mean, if that's the case, why don't we just quintuple wages? Why didn't Trump come in with an executive order and make the minimum wage $100 an hour? And think about how productive we would be. You know, it's funny. I went through the San Juan airport the other day, unfortunately, going to and from St. Bart's, and I noticed that pretty much every single restaurant you had to order yourself. Almost every single one. You had to sit there, go to the screen, pick what you want. And they literally had like one guy working, and it was just the guy cooking the food. And why is that? Well, is that because we had low labor costs? No, it's because we had high labor costs. And does that increase productivity? Absolutely not. I mean, come on. Have you ever tried to order from one of those things? You tell me that increases productivity. Obviously, they're going to take a hit on their top line. It's just that 5% hit that they take on their top line by not taking as many orders. They make it up on the bottom line because wages are so high. So on net, are they more productive? Not really. Not really. Now, I guess you could argue they're making a similar amount of stuff with fewer people. That may be more productive, but then that kind of defeats your argument for the tariffs that this would bring all these high-paying jobs to the United States. Because if you're defining productivity by using fewer workers, then that doesn't mean higher wages. Okay, so now they go into here, and again, I want to try to be as fair as I can and objective as I can. But even if you are in favor of tariffs, which that's great, that's fine. You know, this is a debate that we should be having back and forth on the costs and the benefits and the trade-offs. But you can't look at this argument and really, the majority of this, it's tough to take seriously. Like this one, tariffs may increase the inflation of consumer goods, but this would be offset by a deflation of assets and debts. Okay, but if it's deflation in assets, actually, I read this article, so I'm leaving out a lot here. Let me go over his argument. His argument is you would have a lot less foreign capital coming into the United States. And if you had less foreign capital coming into the United States, you wouldn't have all of these brown people and yellow people and people who kind of smell funny buying all of our real estate. And they're the reason why our real estate prices are at all-time highs. It has nothing to do with the Fed. It has nothing to do with stimmies. It has nothing to do with government spending. The only reason housing costs are sky high is because of foreigners. That's basically the argument that they're making. So I kind of left that part out. So, I mean, you guys know from watching this channel, you've got common sense. Okay, maybe some of the price increase is due to foreigners, maybe, you know, in California, New York, something like that. But you're telling me the high cost of real estate in Iowa is because of the Chinese and the Indians and the Mexicans? I mean, come on. So this is another argument that right off the bat, it's hard time taking this one seriously. Even though, to be fair, I think that there are some good arguments as to why tariffs would have a positive effect. There's no doubt they would benefit some people. There is absolutely no doubt about that. It's just, I believe that when you look at the pros and the cons, you look at the trade-offs, you look at the costs and the benefits, the costs would far outweigh the benefits in the long run. But why did I bring this up? Because if you're someone that believes that tariffs are the way to economic prosperity, then we've got someone in the White House right now that most likely will implement tariffs. So that would be a tailwind, right? And then you've got the tailwind that we talked about with the industrial production jumping here. We've got the tailwind of construction jobs still going up. We've got the tailwind of the delinquency rate on the credit cards going down. And we've got the tailwind, or at least the indicator of loans and leases, although below trend, not being in like the danger zone. So and then we've got the dollar going down, which is in and of itself a huge, huge, huge tailwind. Now, that doesn't completely offset what would likely cause a recession, but it's definitely a tailwind. It makes things better than they otherwise would have been. So, like I said at the beginning here, I try to be as thorough as I can. So much of what you get in the mainstream media is just bull, buy, Jim Cramer, CNBC. You guys get it. That I try to point out some of the cracks in the dam here, that although the dam hasn't broken yet, we want to point out and say, hey, but let's pay attention to these things, because a lot of the cracks in the dam, I think, match up with anecdotally what you guys are seeing in your own life. And when you're talking to your friends, when you're talking to your family members, when you try to pay the rent, when you try to buy groceries, and you're like, at the end of the month, I'm tapped out. Like my paycheck just isn't going as far. Prices have gone up. My wages haven't gone up as much. Therefore, my purchasing power is lower than it is or was in 2019. And I see this with all my friends. I see the labor market softening. So that tells me that we're likely going into a recession. So that could be the anecdotal stuff. You take that with what else we've said on this channel when we're looking at the cracks in the dam. But then you also have to contrast that with some of this data that we've been talking about here that does not point to a recession yet. So we've got to watch this closely. And then if you are someone that believes that tariffs and taxing the American citizen is the way to the promised land, then that's an additional tailwind that would potentially prevent us from an economic contraction. There you go. George Gammon, Rebel Capitalist, fair and balanced. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. As always, make sure you're standing up for freedom, liberty, free market capitalism. I'll see you on the next video.